Story 1. I have several stories from when I worked as a mortuary transport tech. The job was basically transporting the deceased from where they were to where they needed to go. Turns out dead people can have a lot of appointments. One time, though, I had an experience I've never forgotten. I was dropping someone off at the science donation place. This is when you donate your body to science, and they take it from there. So I wheeled in the deceased, unlocked the freezer, and did all the stuff I had to do in there. I placed him on the board, got the lift out, and placed him on the shelf. The interesting thing about the freezer was that most everything, once it's processed, was wrapped in this blue tape type thing. And you could definitely tell what was inside. Legs, hands, feet, etc. Kind of interesting to me at the time. Anyway, I shut the freezer and locked it back up and started wheeling the gurney back over to the garage door. The science drop-off and processing area was a big L shape, with the freezer off to the larger long portion. And then you turn the corner, and there are desks and filing cabinets and whatnot. I about had a heart attack as I turned the corner, and there was just this guy, standing there examining files in the file cabinet. Looked just like you or me, dressed modernly, but out of place with what people normally wear back there. I stopped and said that he'd have to forgive me, but he almost gave me a heart attack. It didn't look like he heard me at all, or even knew I was there. I should mention this was also about 1 a.m., and I'd never seen anyone at the place this late. So I said, "Well, sorry if I startled you or anything," and went on about my finishing up stuff. Got the gurney back in the van, closed and locked the large garage door from the inside. All the while, this guy was just standing there, staring at an open file in front of him, not paying any attention to me. I had to use the bathroom, so I told him that's where I'd be going and I'd be right back. Again, no response. I thought maybe he was deaf and couldn't hear me. So I went to the bathroom and came back to the garage, and the guy was gone, but the file cabinet was still open. I didn't know where he went, and I hadn't heard anyone walk down the hallway past the bathroom. I checked and made sure everything I was responsible for was still locked, and it was. So I just announced that I was going to be leaving and locking up to set the alarm. No response. And that's what I did, and left. I'm not sure who he was or is or what happened, but it was definitely an odd experience and one I still remember perfectly. I have a few other memories about my time at the job if anyone else wants to hear. Nothing like what happened above, though. Story 2, I, 27M, worked as a groundskeeper at a cemetery for 2 summers in my hometown. About 2,000 people, so everyone kind of knew each other. We were doing a cremation burial for a woman who wanted her ashes with her husband's who had passed in 2014. So we dug the hole where his ashes were and left the box open for the family to do the rest later that day. The sexton and administration left to do some paperwork and told me to hang out for a minute and they'll be back. So I lit a cigarette and sat down with my back against the headstone leaning on it. After a minute or two, I heard an old voice say to me, "You shouldn't smoke." And I said, "Yeah, I know." But then it hit me that nobody else was around. So I looked, and sure enough, nobody was there. So I sit next to the hole, and after I put out my cigarette, the voice comes back and asks me, "Are you burying Nora?" The wife. And I replied with, "Yes, sir." So then his voice changes from casual to excited, and he starts telling me how happy he is that it's finally happening, and that he doesn't know how long he's been waiting for, but feels like 1,000 years. After listening to him for about 5 minutes, the family shows up, and the voice vanishes. I let out a few tears of joy for Mr. Edwards, the husband, left some of my trade beads underneath the box as my own little reunion, parting gift, and told the family that everything was ready for them. They saw me crying and asked if I knew Nora. I just said, only from her husband, and left the family to do their thing. Later that week, I was weed eating the headstones. I stopped by Edward's headstone, And for a brief moment, all I heard was laughter, a man's and a woman's, like a calm wind in my ear. Then nothing but silence since. Story 3. Years ago, I worked at a company that at one point in the early 20th century had been the city dispo for unclaimed bodies. Prior to our occupation, there had been 4 or 5 crematoriums located in the building, though by the time I was there, we only had 2 of them converted into high-temperature ceramics kilns. These were later removed due to maintenance issues and a lack of parts. In any case, the entire building was haunted, though the worst of the hauntings were in and around the 2 old retorts. Our most common ghosts were a trio of ghosts. The ghosts were a little girl about 10 or 11 who really didn't do anything more than play and liked to pull pranks on people, a tall lady who would just watch you work from time to time, and a very angry man in a suit. The girl's ghost really never did much beyond move things around, or sometimes you'd see her run around a corner or one of the kilns and then vanish. The lady wasn't much trouble, just felt rather sad anytime we saw her or felt she was around. She didn't really do much beyond wandering around the building where the old retorts, crematoriums, were. The man, though, oh Lord, he was angry. Very angry. Especially toward those of us who worked the kilns, ours retorts. There were other spirits too, maybe half a dozen or so, but these 3 were the most well-known. It was always figured, given the spirits, that they were unclaimed deceased persons who ended up cremated there and buried off-site. Given the religious nature of the area and the forbidding of cremation by the church, LDS, we always figured that the spirits were making themselves known. Story 4. I was working in the ICU a few decades ago, and before that, I worked in hospice, so patients passing away wasn't a big surprise. Anyway, we had had a fair share of gruesome cases. A couple even involved children. Some of these young people died way too young because of accidents that came from attempted suicide or severe car crash victims. The hospital had been in service for nearly 70 years, and there had been reported paranormal activity from when the building first opened. This has ranged from objects moving, object displacement, and lights malfunctioning. However, on the darker side, there's been cases of people seeing shadow figures and even ghost patients, especially children. Probably the worst I've heard is staff seeing a demon in dark hallways and crawling on the ceiling. I would say at least 10,000 people have passed away here, so at nighttime it can get extremely unsettling, knowing that most activity is reported at night. On to the point. I was working overtime and into the night. It was around 4 a.m. if I remember correctly. My coworker at the time was in a different sector at the time when all of a sudden I heard an ear-piercing shriek. So I immediately ran to the sector he was in and saw him on the floor looking terrified. I asked him what the hell happened, and he said he saw a patient walk from room 57 to room 58. I told him that it was probably just a patient that got up to use the bathroom. He said that there was only one patient in the sector and he had to use a urinal bottle for bathroom activities. I asked him if there were any other staff with him, and he said, yes, Jared is with me, but he's behind me. I said, then who was it then? All he did was shrug. Me and him passed it off as a hallucination and continued our shift. After a while, me and him are cleaning in the same hallway and hear thuds down the hall. Relax. It's just another staff member, which it fortunately was. After that, we begin to hear much fainter thuds from below us. There was other staff on the bottom floor, so we passed it off as that. We learned that when we heard the thuds that they had just left for a staff change days later. Anyway, I'm walking to room 75, and I see something zooming past me in the corner of my eye. I asked my coworker, "What was that?" "What was what?" my coworker said. "The little shadow that just went past us," I said. "Stop saying random shit trying to scare me. It's not funny," my coworker said. As soon as I said that, we heard a door slam shut. At this point, we were getting freaked out, and I called out to Jared, to which he didn't respond. We learned later Jared had gone to the bottom floor. Then another door slammed shut. Then, me and my coworker, I saw something we could not describe. It looked like a blob of darkness coming straight at us. It sped and made a ghastly moan. We started running for our lives. We stopped at the end of the sector and glanced back. Nothing. No evidence that we had just been attacked. Me and my coworker glanced down the hall into the darkness and see nothing but inky black. Whatever had followed us went away. After that, the next 2 hours were uneventful until a giant crash came from a different sector on our floor. All the staff rushed up to the source of the noise and saw a large piece of equipment had crashed on the floor. "Check the patient in room 57, I say. The person who checked the patient came back, says the patient was startled, but not scared. The rest of the night consisted of everybody seeing shit in the corner of our eye, but nothing else big happened. Probably the scariest experience of my life. After that night, I had no more night shifts in hospice. Eventually, I transferred to the ICU and only worked until 2 a.m. Story 5. My aunt was a cemetery worker and told me an absolute cracker that happened to her. There was an old chap who would come every Monday at the same time, rain, hail, or shine, and put roses on his wife's grave. He was a well-known regular visitor and would always stop and chat with the workers, including my aunt. Anyway, she was working on this fine Monday, and she saw this chap at his wife's grave like usual. He'd just changed out the roses, and she went over to ask if he'd like to give the old ones to her to dispose of. What followed was a normal 20-minute chat, talking about all kinds of things. He had to go, so she waved him off, and he left. The next day when she turned up for work, there was a new work order for that morning. So grabbing the backhoe, she went out to find the plot. Turns out, it was right next to the chap's wife. Frowning, she checked the work order again and saw it was the old roses guy. She dug the grave, got it prettied up for the service, and later that morning, the funeral home turned up to enter him. She went up to the funeral guy in charge, you get to know everyone after a while, and asked why they rushed to bury the old chap. Mortuary worker. "What do you mean, why the rush?" Aunt. "Well, he was here yesterday putting roses on his wife's grave. What happened to him?" Mortuary worker. He died on Thursday last week." Aunt. "No, he was here yesterday." Points at the fresh roses on his wife's grave. Mortuary worker, looking at the flowers. "You sure it was him?" Aunt, starting to get the shivers. "Yeah, we had a chat like we always do. He was talking about being excited about his new granddaughter." Mortuary worker. "Wait, what? How did you know about that? She hasn't even told her husband she's pregnant yet." Aunt, points at the chap's grave. "He told me yesterday." Mortuary worker. "Wow. Yep, bona fide ghost." Story 6. When I worked as a nurse on a medical floor, I rarely worked the night shift, but remember a time I did get scheduled overnight around a holiday. After visiting hours ended, the security guard at the front desk would call the unit if anyone came into the hospital, asking to visit a patient. One night around 1 a.m., a patient who was in hospice care passed away, peacefully and expectedly. My friend was the patient's nurse and called the family to let them know she had passed. The primary contact was her daughter, and that was who our staff had become familiar with while she was in the hospital. We knew it was going to take her about an hour to arrive. About 10 minutes later, security called up saying a man was at the desk, requesting to visit that room. We said, sure, that's fine, assuming it was family that got the news. 15 minutes pass and no one comes up. We called security and he just gave us the description of the guy and his first name. Said he took the elevators but didn't see him leave the way he came in yet. When the patient's daughter finally arrived, we mentioned this to her and asked if any other family was stopping by because we were worried they got lost coming to the unit. She said she and the one other sister that came along were the only living family members. The patient had a brother who had passed fairly recently with the same name security gave us and the same description. They weren't all too spooked like we were. For all we know, some random guy was roaming the hospital up to no good. But the staff did find it strange he was asking for that specific room number. It spooked us enough that a few of us went to the front desk ourselves to ask about it. The security guard sees so many people that he tries to give a good description of the guy, but can't really pinpoint details. I guess we'll never know. Oddly enough, I went on to work in a home hospice for a few years and didn't have any specific creepy stories. With that said, I am not super spiritual, but every deceased person, without a doubt, had their own energy and aura around them. I would have to do pronouncement visits often. Some patients would make the hair on my neck stand up and I'd get very anxious with that impending doom feeling. Others would wash over warmth and calm feelings that would make me forget about any stress I was having. I could never anticipate what energy I'd encounter. Story 7. I work as a CNA in a nursing home, so I see a lot of death. I do the care as they hit the end of life and prepare the bodies too once they pass. These are residents who I spend hours and days caring for, though most of them don't even recall a single CNA just due to the deterioration of their brains, chalk memories. Some will hang on for days, with nothing but some water sponged into their mouth and morphine to soothe their pain until they just finally slip away. Some will walk down the hall, go, lay down in bed, and die. Others will talk to deceased spouses or call out for their mothers. Very few will hold your hand, talk to you like you're their dearest friend, and thank you for helping them before they go. It's sad, but I truly believe all of them have moved onwards. When they come to me, most of them are dementia-ridden. If they're going to haunt somewhere, it won't be in the tiny room that they believed was a hotel they were staying at for a night for the past 6 years. Still, once I moved to working the knock shift, the nursing home got a lot more creepy. I've walked into rooms at 3 a.m. and I'll turn around to find my resident randomly out of bed and hiding in the corner. The thickened water is in the kitchens, which are pitch black at night, so I walk through it using just my walkie flashlight. It gives off horror movie vibes. So, when the actual ghost shit happens, it's enough to really wake you up. I often hear a walker moving through the halls, even though no one is up. I heard a deep, growling scream for help, but I couldn't figure out which room it was coming through. The chairs in the dining room also often rearrange themselves, even after I neaten them up, or things will fall off the dining room tables. It's not much for intensity, but when you're exhausted, constantly walking through dim halls into dark rooms, listening for any sign of a resident calling out or coming out of their room, it makes you more prone to jumpiness. Story 8. I was a CNA in a dementia unit. My first time working the graveyard shift alone was terrifying. The ghosts really gave me a welcome party. The night started out with me doing the residents' laundry, and the lights kept turning off, leaving me in the dark, and the soap falling off the shelves. Each time I went into the laundry room, lights turned off, and soap would push itself off the shelves. Then I went to do my rounds and check on residents. I was changing a resident, and their door flew open and knocked a couple of pictures off the wall. Finished with the rounds, went to the front and waited for the next round. A door in the first hall kept opening and closing. Each time I'd get up to check, it would stop. And as soon as I turned my back, the door would start again. I'd do my rounds again, and one resident kept saying there was a door that kept opening and closing. Told them everything was okay and helped them calm down. Then they told me a man kept coming into their room. I showed them their room and said, "Nothing is there." Then they shook their head and said, "He's right behind you in the dark." I low-key freaked. 5 a.m. rolled around, and I would hear feet shuffling down the hallway and a squeaky walker ID check, and there was nothing. Turned my back, and it started again. Found out there was a resident who would wake up at 5 a.m. and shuffle down the hallway with their squeaky walker. They passed a month before I started. I believe it was ghosts. It was an old folks' home, and people would pass all the time. Story 9, I worked in body donation. I knew of a guy who died twice. Backstory, the events of his first passing had created a problem we didn't anticipate, basically exposed a hole in our standard operating procedures. I was asked to investigate and rewrite the SOPs so the situation wouldn't happen again. 2 weeks later, I was annoyed that the same problems happened again with another death. This meant someone didn't follow the new SOPs. When I investigated the second incident, I was shocked to learn the new situation involved a person by the same name as the previous guy. No one ever has the same name, especially his name, because it is unique. That's why I recognized it right away. The problem was, I seemed to be the only one that knew of the first incident. When I looked for the records, they were gone. Everyone remembered the SOP changes, but didn't know why. All emails referencing the first instance were either gone or missing language about his death. I was stumped and left with the mystery swirling in my head without any resolution. Fast forward about a year later, I went to work with a person in the first responder department. We shared ghost stories when she admitted she knew a donor who had died twice. She thought, like me, she was the only witness who remembered the first time. She was the person who took the first death call and worked with the wife. Her recollections of the problems that happened were the same as mine. 1 week after this man's supposed death, the wife called her and said, "He is still here and he won't leave. We made love last night. He knows he died, but won't go. What do I do?" No one knows WTF to do when reality gets wholly twisted, but he eventually died again a week later, and the second time seemed to stick. He was a Native American. I'm still stunned by these events. It makes me question everything I think I know. Story 10. My father-in-law was an embalmer for 30 years. He has the creepiest stories. Probably one of the scariest ones was on Christmas Eve. The funeral home wanted someone on site at all times, I guess in case someone dies. This was also not in the States, so their rules were probably very different. It was his turn to stay the night, but his wife wanted to spend Christmas with him, so they and their child stayed at the funeral home that night. They both were on the floor with their kid between them, and they both started to feel strange. It was almost a feeling of confusion. He asked her if she felt that, and she said she did. They both got to their knees and began to pray. While they did, they heard banging on the door to the room they were in from the inside of the funeral home. I want to say it was coming from where the bodies were kept, but I could be wrong about the specific room, where they were alone. The door was bulging like someone or something was trying to rip the door off its hinges. This is where it gets a bit weird. Even though they had their eyes closed, they could both see, though they didn't tell the other person until years later what they saw, a big, shadowy figure trying to come into the room. I'm not sure how they knew, but both were certain that it was coming for their child. There were also 2 bright figures keeping it back from them. But the demon, because surely that's what it was very strong and kept trying to break into the room. They continued to pray, and eventually another bright figure came, and the 3 angels, because surely that's what they were able to fight back the demon.
Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.